Good morning, everybody. I just want to say again that if you're newer to our community, you're most welcome here. If you're new to our community, we've been going through a series through 1st and 2nd Samuel. There have been a lot of things happening, and today, if you're newer to the Bible, this is going to feel like a lot. Okay, and if you've been and if you're not as new to the Bible, if you've been reading the Bible and following Jesus for a while, this is going to be a lot. Okay, and so just know it's going to be a lot. I would say that I'm going to put kind of a PG-13 rating on today. We're going to be dealing with some heavy topics. And so if any of you are kind of wondering or questioning whether or not this is for you, I just want you to have that in your head, that there may be points along the way that hit differently, that hit on wounds and things like that. And so we want to be cognizant that everybody is bringing their story into this conversation. And so with that, we want to kind of launch in. I titled the sermon, "The Pain of Sin," and so we start heavy. But actually, we start back in chapter 8 and chapter 9 and chapter 10 with some positive things. And so I want 5 people, so first 5 up, I'm not, you don't even have to raise your hand, just get up here. I want 5 people to come play Jenga. Okay, and please do your best to not knock it down. Okay, so 5 people coming up and start pushing and poking and doing your thing. All right, so everybody get 1 block. You get 1 block to move. Okay, all right. I have 2. I need 3 more. Y'all come on up together. Like there's 3. Can I have 2 more? There's 4 and somebody else. There's 5. Great. Okay. Yeah. So just do it like that and keep going. All right, so while they're doing that, I know it's going to be impossible for you to pay attention to me, but try. I want to go through chapters 8, 9, and 10, specifically with what we see the author doing in these chapters as it pertains to David and his kingship. All right, so chapter 8, I'm going to summarize some stuff. So verse 6, the Lord gave David victory wherever he went. Okay, verse 13, and David became famous. Verse 14, the Lord gave David victory. Verse 15, David reigned over all of Israel, doing what was right and just for all of his people. So think about that, right and just for all of his people. And nobody's paying attention because you just want to see Michaela not knock it over. Okay, great job, everybody. All right, thank you. So chapter 8, David reigned over all of Israel, doing what was just and right for all of his people. Are we giving David a thumbs up or a thumbs down? The answer is going to be thumbs up every time I do this, okay? So just help me out here. Chapter 9, okay? So again, that was chapter 8. Chapter 9, David sees Mephibosheth, who is actually a son of Jonathan, who he loved and who he had a great relationship with. And David begins chapter 9 by saying, is there anyone still left in the house of Saul to whom I can show kindness for Jonathan's sake? Someone says, actually, one of his sons is here. But specifically, he is cast aside for kind of all the reasons that he's a part of the house of Saul and you've done away with that, but also because he's lame in both feet. And so David actually says, I want you to come, not just to be cared for right now, but you can live in the palace for the rest of your days. All of the land is going to be given back to you, and you're going to be cared for as one of my sons and eat at my table for the rest of your life. Did David do a good thing? Yes. Justice is brought about to this man who is pushed aside by society and all of this stuff. So David is doing a very good thing. Chapter 10, to basically sum it up, it's a giant war, it's a giant battle. But what we see is David initiates it by actually offering kindness, but it's returned with hostility. And so he's like, oh, if that's how we're going to roll, then I'm going to take y'all out. And that's exactly what happens. And if you remember in chapter 8, the Lord gave David victory wherever he went. So again, David puts forth something that most people would say is in good faith. There are some people that go, and even the people that are doing it, they're like, no, he's trying to be shady right now. But what we recognize is that the Lord still gave him victory. So thumbs up. Good job, David. And so what we realize is that David's been building his kingdom. Okay, so there's a lot of things that he's been stacking on top of things. And I've been trying to figure out like how to consider all of the violence and the pillaging and all of the stuff that's happening in these chapters leading up to this. And so I don't know if you're familiar with like English lore, specifically in the Middle Ages, but I love like shows about that kind of stuff. And specifically there's a show called Last Kingdom where there are all these disparate tribes and clans of people that are on the island of England. And there is someone trying to unify all of these clans to come up with a nation or a kingdom of England. Now, the Vikings are trying to come in and the people from the north, and there's a lot of fighting and all this stuff. And so what you have is massive carnage, you have massive fighting, but you have a consolidation of power, you have a consolidation of resources, you have consolidations of leadership, and all of these things. That's kind of what's going on with David. Okay? So he is basically going in and trying to gather clans and gather people and do all of this stuff to create a reign over this entire region that can kind of come under his kingship. And so what we want to talk about is the way that he's been stacking up all of these things. But as you can see along the way, there are holes in parts of the foundation. And these holes represent all of the ways that we've been talking about where it seemed like David was doing something a little shady or a lot shady. And it was in the midst of him maybe doing a good thing or maybe receiving blessing. And so there is this kingdom that's being built, but it's being built in different places throughout the passages that we've been reading on David compromising, on David not being his full self devoted to God, of using power to manipulate, of not recognizing the dignity and the humanity of different people along the way, conniving and scheming. And what we're going to see in chapters 11 and 12 is that the kingdom starts to become top-heavy. And as we know with Jenga, eventually you get to a point where the bottom cannot support the weight of the top, and it topples. So, as I was working on chapters 11 and 12, I started noticing a lot of different themes. And so as I started writing stuff down, about 2 or 3 points into this, of these different themes that I started to look at, I realized that everything was starting to start with the letter C. So this is completely unintentional. I'm actually really sorry about it, but I have a 5-point sermon that all begins with C. Chad is so frustrated about it. Yeah, your name starts with a C. I just want to point it out. So I never do this if you're new to our community, but it just kind of happened, and I was like, all right, we're going to roll with it. What's that?
I love it.
Okay, there you go. Yeah, it feels like good. Yeah, us former Baptists, we get this, right? All right, so, all right, the first thing that I want to point out specifically in chapter 11 is in verse 1. So in verse 1 of chapter 11, in the spring, at the time when kings go off to war, David sent Joab out to the king's men and the whole Israelite army. They destroyed the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah, but David remained in Jerusalem. Now, what the author is doing here is he's setting up very specifically the chapters in front of this and then this verse in particular. David has been doing all the things that we see in 8, 9, and 10. Good stuff, good stuff, good stuff. The Lord gave him favor. He was doing nice things to people. He was taking care of all of Israel. He was doing all of this stuff. And then, as would be typical for the springtime, everybody goes to war. Now, it is probably going to be around the month of March, which we're in right now. March was actually named after the Greek god of war, Mars, because all of the region, once the rainy season was over and the roads dried up and the grass started to grow so that their animals could be fed along the way, would go into battle. So this is typical. Everybody knows you take a break during winter and then you go to war in the spring. Even if it was just ceremonial, it was always customary for the king, the leader of the troops, to go to the first battle, but then, my generals are going to take it from here, but I'm going to go with my guys because that's how we roll. But the author is very specific right here to go, but David didn't. All of Israel goes to war to besiege this city, but Israel's leader stays back. So the first C that I have for you is complacency. There's at least a potential that David starts to believe his own press. There's at least a potential that he starts to realize, dude, I've got a pretty good tower going here. And he's not paying attention to things below, but what he's recognizing is that I can just kind of sit back because look at all I've done, look at all I'm accomplishing, look at the amount of wealth that I have, look at the consolidation of the surrounding area. I'm actually like solid. And because of that, I'm not gonna go to battle. They don't need me. And I mean, sure, I'm supposed to and all that stuff, but I mean, this is a chance for me to just kind of take it easy, rest on my laurels, pay attention to my kingdom that I've built. Complacency. Complacency can turn into all kinds of things, right? It can be a restful season and we can take in the blessings of God, but there are times when we take those blessings and we spin them to us. We make them about us. And then all of a sudden, now the blessings aren't actually from God, they're just blessings for us because of what we did. And we see this immediately in the second verse. So the second C that I have for you, the first one is complacency, the second one is cheating. One evening, David got up from his bed and he walked around on the roof of his palace. From the roof, he saw a woman bathing. The woman was very beautiful, and David sent someone out to find out about her. The man said, "She's Bathsheba, the daughter of Elam, and the wife of Uriah the Hittite." And then David sent messengers to go get her. She came to him, and he slept with her. Now, she was purifying herself from her monthly uncleanness. Now, the reason for this parenthetical is the author wants us to know explicitly she had just had her period right before this happens, and so there is no way that she is pregnant prior to her encounter with David. Then she went back home. The woman conceived and sent word to David saying, "I'm pregnant." So David's complacency has him walking around on the roof of his house, like enjoying the afternoon, like chilling, just kind of, overlooking his kingdom and all of this stuff. And he sees a beautiful woman. Now, most scholars would say that David absolutely knew who this was. He didn't need to ask, but he felt like asking anyway. And then once she was brought to him, he for sure would have had context. And so there's a lot of ways that we see David cheat here. We see him cheat on his own family because, again, some of these fractures that are already in here that are going to start to be exposed and as we get top heavy are going to bring the downfall of the kingdom is the fact that David is a womanizer. It's even possible that David had a sex addiction because here's a guy who has 6 wives. He has other people on his side. And all throughout, we've seen these cracks of him leaning into his sexual identity, the way that he would go about. And what we see here specifically is that he cheats on his own family. There's no covenant that he's beholding himself to that God would have given him. Whether it's don't have a bunch of wives because that's not what kings do, or the fact that you have wives and you're still going to take people. He's also cheating on Bathsheba's family. And this is some of the ways that we think, or that most scholars would look at and go, he absolutely knew who this woman was. Her husband was part of an elite fighting force called the Mighty Men. So Uriah was actually, check this out, an elite force that was fighting for his king David while David was sleeping with his wife. He would have been cheating on her dad too because her dad, who's mentioned here in the passage, Elam, was also one of these fighting men. He was also one of these elite force guys. And so the king is going to know about the SEAL Team 6s of his crew. He's going to have talk with them. He's going to have done whatever. But then there's even more because her grandfather is specifically noted as one of David's key advisors. He knows all of her family. And he cheats on all of them. And then he cheats on Bathsheba herself. We don't know what, if any, part that she played in their sexual encounter. There are a lot of conversations around this of how much coercion was happening versus how much was she a willing participant. But it is certain that David's abuse of his positional influence was at play because he brought her. If you look at the way that the passage goes, it says he slept with her. He got her. It's all initiated from him, and then to whatever degree she responds, or is just simply caught up in the fact that he's the king and he just gets full reign. Scripture doesn't give us a clear direction, but what we do see is that the biblical account only addresses David's sin. And the power differential is overwhelming. Especially in the ancient Near East, especially in this time period, this would have been the way of the day. Women were thought of more as property than people. The fact that she is not protected by her husband because he's off at war right now would have given her more vulnerability. There are all kinds of ways where David, through his consolidation of power and through him making it so much about himself, is cheating literally everybody. Now, the church has spoken a lot about the temptation of lust and decried the sexualization of our society, and rightly so. And we can look at this passage and go, David's sexual sins play a major role in what's happening right here. All of that's true. But at the same time, the church has and can overlook the temptation of power's corrosive influence in our heart and our misuse of our positional influence. Many of those in the church today are willing to condemn any acts of sexual indiscretion and ignore or even celebrate those pursuing or wielding power as long as it benefits them and their cause. And this should not be. The church has a responsibility to speak to other brothers and sisters and say, all of this is wrong. If some of it's wrong, all of it's wrong. Yes, your sexual sin has to be called out because of the wake that it causes as far as the pain of sin, but also the pain and the sin of power grabbing and of usurping God's authority and taking authority on your own and hurting people has to be called out. Now, for a lot of the series, we've talked specifically about the ways that David is a foreshadowing of Jesus, that David is in the lineage of Jesus, and out of the house of David, Jesus is going to come on the scene. And all of those things are still true. But what we see specifically in chapters 11 and moving forward to the rest of 2 Samuel is David now becomes the anti-hero. Any Swiftie fans in here? Huh? Let's go. And so thank God for Jesus. And thank God that even in the middle of David and the abhorrent things that are taking place right here, Jesus is not beholden to all of who David was. Mark chapter 10, verse 47 or 42. You know that those who are regarded as rulers of the Gentile lord it over them. Think about the power dynamics here, the power differentials. And their high officials exercise authority over them. Not so with you, followers of mine. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be a servant, and whoever wants to be first must be a slave of all. Of all. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. Philippians chapter 2, starting in verse 3, do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit, or power grabbing, or trying to build your own kingdom. Rather, in humility, value others as yourselves. Think about the indictment of this passage as what we're reading in chapter 11 of 2 Samuel. Not looking to your own interest, but each of you the interest of others. In your relationships with one another, have the same mindset as Christ Jesus, who, being in very nature God, having all of the power, he didn't need to consolidate it, it was his anyway. Did not consider equality with God something to be used for his own advantage. Thank you, Jesus, that you have come to show us what it's like to be human. The third point, the third theme that we see here is cover-ups. And there's a lot of them. 2 Samuel chapter 11, verse 7, when Uriah came to him, David asked him, how Joab was, and how the soldiers were doing and how they were getting along. So what we see is David bringing Uriah in because he's now got to cover up the fact that his wife's pregnant. And so he brings him in and he starts off with like hey, how's the weather? How's the war going? He doesn't care. Then David said to Uriah, go down to your house and wash your feet. This idea of wash your feet is a euphemism for go and make love to your wife. He's trying to get himself off the hook. This is before DNA testing. And so everybody will just assume, okay, yeah, he got home for a little bit and now she's pregnant. That all makes sense. So Uriah left the palace. David's thinking he's got this sorted out. David even gives him a gift to take home to his wife. It's like, hey, here's a box of chocolate and flowers. Like again, the level of just ick in some of these things is overwhelming. But Uriah, instead of going home with Bathsheba, he slept in the entrance of the palace with all the master's servants that did not go down to the house. So David finds out that he didn't actually even go to the house, so there's no way that any of this could have happened. And so David makes a second attempt that involves getting Uriah drunk. And he's like, I'll get him drunk, and then I'm just going to basically push him to the front door, and we're going to get this thing accomplished and case closed. But what happens is that Uriah does the exact same thing again, even in his drunken state. One of the commentators that I read this week said, a drunk Uriah has more honor than a sober David. Right? So none of these ways have worked. The cover-up is still not done yet. So David actually gives the order that Uriah is to be killed. And so he hands a paper that basically explains, put Uriah in the front, in the hardest part of the battle, and then everybody pull back so we can make sure that he dies in this assault on the city. And he gives it to Uriah himself because he knows he's such an honorable man that he's not going to read the note. Uriah takes a note and gives it to the general, and they push forward, but recognizing that it's going to seem weird if Joab just says, hey, everybody, let's pull back, but leave Uriah up there. He realizes that he needs to put some other men with him, so probably some of this special forces group. So they make a surge on the gate, and all of them die as they're pulling back. Now, Joab's a little stressed out because he's like, that exactly wasn't the deal that we were talking about. I killed a lot of the special forces in trying to make sure that Uriah dies. And so he's nervous to send back news to David specifically about the fact that other people died when they were just trying to kill Uriah. When the news reaches David, David's response is, well, that's just the cost of doing business, I guess. The callous nature of which he treats the lives of his own soldiers after having done all of this stuff. So Uriah dies. Bathsheba goes into a period of mourning, which would have been probably around 7 days. And as soon as the period of mourning is over, David brings her to the house and marries her immediately because he's trying to make the timeline work so that people, when she gives birth to this child, will just assume, yeah, that kind of makes sense. It was within the time frame of when people get married and have babies. What's interesting is that in chapter 11, God is not mentioned at all until the very last sentence. What the writer wants us to know is that all of the stuff that's taking place in 11 is because of David's self-interest. It's because of him trying to build his kingdom. It's because of him trying to consolidate power and manipulate the situation so that he isn't found out. And the last sentence that we read in chapter 11 reads like this: but the thing that David did displeased the Lord. This is so much, you guys. This is so much. Frederick Buechner sums all of this section up with scripture, but he also is speaking to the totality. And he writes these words: the Bible is a swarming compost of a book, an Irish stew of poetry and propaganda, law and legalism, myth and murky history and hysteria. Over the centuries, it has become hopelessly associated with tub-thumping evangelism and dreary piety, with supernated superstition and blue-nosed moralizing, with eschatological authoritarianism and crippling literalism. And yet, just because it is a book about both the sublime and the unspeakable, it is a book about the life and the way it really is. In this book about people who at the same time can be both believing and unbelieving, innocent and guilty, crusaders and crooks, full of hope and full of despair. In other words, this book is about us. Mark and our teaching team has said repeatedly that oftentimes the Hebrew scriptures are way more easy to relate to because of just the ways that they're jacked up. And we can find ourselves in these stories. Because God's people had been falling down and covering it up way before David, and they have continued to do so with heartbreaking regularity. Pastors' infidelity. Leaders using power to coerce others into shame or doing something that just they want done. Leaders in churches using church offerings to pay for their self-published or their self-written books to gain wealth, to gain acclaim, and to gain influence. There have been so many scandals, specifically around sexual abuse, that have come out over the last couple of decades. And specifically in 2019, a reporter from Houston broke a story about how the Southern Baptist Church had a secret list of over 700 sexual abusers. There is a lie that the church has had. There is a lie that many Christians have had, that the institution is too big to fail. That if people knew what was really going on, we'd all lose our job, or we would lose the faith of the people. And look at all the good stuff that's happening. Look at what we're creating. Don't you see that this is too valuable? And in so doing, we have lost so many people who have been in the church and are so disenfranchised with an institution that is way more interested in building itself up top instead of paying attention to the cracks and the fissures and being real. And again, thank God for Jesus. I titled this the Pain of Sin, and I've sat with so many people that either have had sin in their own life and there's just all of this collateral impact, or people who have been the collateral impact of other people's sins. And one of the things that I've walked away from whenever Chad and I have talked about this stuff is I'm so sad for the person and all of that, but I am so angry at sin. And I'm just frustrated that sin propagates itself with so many followers of Jesus, and that the church hasn't been willing to go, this is not the way of Jesus. We get an opportunity to invite people into a bigger reality, into something that's more beautiful, and to not cover things up, but to actually bring light into dark places, to bring grace. To say, what you're doing is not right, and there is a way out, and I want to be with you in that. Luke 19, we see this with Jesus. He's walking down the road, and in verse 5, he recognizes this dude up in a tree, and he looks at him and he says, hey, Zacchaeus, come down immediately. I need to stay at your house today. And so he came down at once and he welcomed him gladly. And all the people began to mutter. And this is that way where we can throw rocks at sinners. But this is not the way of Jesus. He has gone to be the guest of a sinner. But Zacchaeus stood up and he said to the Lord, look, Lord, here and now I give half of my possessions to the poor, and if I had cheated anybody out of anything, I will pay back 4 times the amount. And Jesus said to him, today salvation has come to this house, because this man too is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost. We do not, in this context, see where Jesus sat down with him and kind of walks Zacchaeus through all the things that he did wrong, all the ways that he did it. But instead, Jesus bringing himself, his God self, his human self, his grace-filled self, his light and darkness self into proximity of Zacchaeus. Zacchaeus, because of the magnitude, the brilliance of Jesus, says, I want to make it right. Jesus is so compelling. And we get the opportunity to invite people, just like Chad was talking about with the Easter, not to come to church, but to get next to Jesus. The next C, if you're following along, is confrontation. Nathan, the prophet at the moment, is called by God to go say some really hard things to David. Because basically he finds out, like God lets him know, David cheated, David murdered, and because of all this and all the fissures, David's house is coming down. Now go tell him that. So Nathan's a prophet, and prophets do and say hard things, but I cannot imagine that it was easy for Nathan to just stroll up into David's palace and be like, hey bro, you did some gnarly stuff, and now God is super mad. David had already killed a man to cover this up, and now Nathan knows all of this and is supposed to go tell him that his house is going to crumble because of everything that he's done. This had to take incredible courage, deep prayer, assurance from God that this was exactly the right thing to say and do at that moment. And he offers it in a whimsical way. In a whimsical way. Nathan could have come in and said, God told me that you've done some horrible stuff and your house is coming down from it. That could have been the way that he did it, but instead, Nathan tells a story of a rich man that has lots of cattle, lots of sheep, and he has a visitor come. And then he tells us a story about a man who only has one sheep. He's a poor man, and the sheep actually is like a daughter. It sleeps with him, like they play together, they do all of this stuff. And the rich man, having all of this, decides that he doesn't want to use any of his livestock for the meal, but he takes the man's sheep that the man dearly loved, slaughters it for the guest so they can have. David is furious. And he actually says that man needs to die. And he needs to repay 4 times. Does that sound familiar? 4 times what's owed to all of this stuff. And Nathan says, the man's you. You have 6 wives. You have all the women that you need to take care of whatever it is that's going on in you that just needs women. And you took and you murdered, and you covered it up. The man's you. Tim McMahon, when we were reading this passage, he says that we don't often recognize the influence that art plays in this section. Storytelling. I think he's right. Nathan spoke truth to power through art and creativity. I think a lot of times that we're tempted to reduce speaking truth to power to being louder than anyone else who disagrees with us, posting unsubstantiated or false claims about a leader, resonating to name calling, character assassination, dehumanizing rhetoric. And we do all of this in the name that that leader is wrong or evil, and my means justify the end of them being ousted of their power. Let it not be with Jesus' people. Can we have a creative imagination in speaking truth to power? And the last one's confession. Last C. So Nathan blows him up with all of this. And what we see in verse 13 is David said to Nathan, I have sinned against the Lord. Now, the blueprint for confession that we see here is actually found in Psalm 51, which is basically David's journal entry as this is happening. So the days and potentially the weeks after the confrontation with Nathan, where he realizes all of the stuff, he recognizes the wake of his sin and all of the collateral impact that is happening along the way. And so in Psalm 51, I want to pull out again just a few themes that we have. In verse 1, have mercy on me, O God. It's a recognition that God is other, that my sin is against God, which David actually says. And have mercy on me actually leads to the part of that mercy is possible. Verse 3, for I know my transgressions. And it's not just simply, hey, God, I'm sorry for that stuff that I did that was bad. It has at this heart of it of being able to name those things specifically and go, God, I know that this was going on and this was going on. Cleanse me with hyssop so that I will be clean. It actually refers to the sacrificial system and the way that they would take this bush and like hit it and the oils would come out and there was a lot of other stuff going on, but basically saying, I know that there's a way with you to be made right. And then verses 16 and 17, again, with this idea of sacrifice and all that's going on, it would have made sense to a lot of them just like go to the church and do a bunch of stuff. And I think a lot of times we think that too. Okay, I've been screwing up a whole lot lately. Let me just go to church and do a bunch of stuff. But what we see here is actually a precursor to what many of the prophets are going to speak to specifically about the nation of Israel. Isaiah comes to mind of going, God speaking to the people saying, I don't want your sacrifices. Do not give me any more dead animals. I don't care. In fact, your prayers that you're praying right now, I literally am going to turn my back and not listen because your hands are full of blood. And so David, prior to all of this happening, David recognizes this. It's not just a mental assent, but it's actually traveling to his heart in this moment. You do not delight in sacrifice, or I'd bring it. You don't need another dead animal. You do not take a pleasure in a burnt offering, but my sacrifice, O God, is a broken spirit, a contrite heart. You, God, will not despise. David, in this moment, shows audacious humility. And in this way, there is this brilliant juxtaposition of what we get to do when we get to come to God to recognize both, oh my gosh, God, you are so other. I need all of your mercy. I have blown it in all of these ways. And somehow there's a way for me to come boldly to your throne and say, I'm sorry, and you care. And you do something about it. I think it also recognizes a difference here with David, specifically with shame and guilt. Shame would say, I'm putting on all of these things that I've been doing. I'm going to get heavier. It's going to get harder. I'm going to be more identified with what it is that I've been doing. And so now it's not just simply things that I'm doing. I am bad. I am a sexual addict. I am a liar. I am someone who cares way more about myself than anyone else. I was in Alabama a few weeks ago, and we were talking about a lot of heavy stuff, and we were doing a lot of emotional work as it pertains to how it is that we go about justice work. And so those two things, living of going, we got to get ourselves right before we can go and do justice, was really powerful for me. But one of the things in processing through all this stuff that I started to realize, and what I wrote in my own journal was, I am filled with shame. And so God's working on me about how to let that stuff go and not to identify myself with the ways that I see myself blowing it. But instead, what we see with David is him recognizing in the middle of all of these horrible things that I've done, I will not identify with them. I will identify as a follower of you, God, which creates a way to restoration, which creates a way to wholeness. This is the same guy who did all the other stuff that we talked about. And this prayer in Psalm 51, it does not in any way excuse all of the horrible things that he did. But thank God that we have a way to be made right regardless of what we have done. The wake of David's sin will continue to have ripple effects throughout the rest of his life and moving forward. And it makes no sense, and it almost doesn't seem fair that God forgives David, but yet there are all these people over here that are harmed, that are dead, that have to deal with this stuff. But somewhere in there lies the beauty of the cross, because we've all been there. We've all blown it, and we've all hurt other people. But thank God for forgiveness. Hebrews chapter 4, verse 16, it says, let us approach God's throne of grace with confidence, so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need. Thank God for Jesus. So I'm going to invite the band to come on up. We're going to respond. If you're new to our community, when we say respond, what we mean is we recognize that there are so many conversations. And as I was even talking about earlier, we are all bringing our story into this room. And God gets to interface with our story, wherever it is, to have a conversation specifically with us. And so what we do is we take a collective time to go, hey, whatever God's doing with you, do that. Whatever God's saying with you, keep talking. And we're going to do that through singing. We're going to do that through prayer. We're going to do that with communion in a minute. And so I want to give kind of some potential threads to pull that may be helpful for you as you consider, what do I do with all the stuff that I just heard? For you, it may be just confession, that you want to use Psalm 51 as your blueprint to just say, I confess the way that I've used power to either hoard or to abuse. Maybe it's to confess sexual sins. We recognize the wake of sexual sin is way more than just simply about us. Or maybe if you're someone in the room who's been hurt by someone in power, or maybe even someone in the church, maybe what God would want for you right now is for you to feel seen and for you to be healed, or at least be on a journey towards healing. What I love about the Bible is it is unrelenting in its call to go, we can be made new. And that means even in healing. And if you've been hurt, I'm so sorry. And God wants to be close. He wants to speak to you. And sometimes he uses us to do that. And so you can go get prayer and feel seen or feel cared for and loved. And the last one is a courage and a creativity to speak truth to power that has at its core Jesus' kingdom. So often when we think about speaking truth to power, it's about what I can get out of it, or it's about advocating for myself. And I think some of you know that you're supposed to speak truth to power in that board meeting. You're supposed to speak truth to power with a manager that's just melting down the team. Or maybe it's even political. But it's done in ways that look different, that are an alternative kingdom. So maybe you need courage. Maybe you need creativity. And so in all of these ways and in any other ways, bring your story and have God meet you in your story. He wants to meet with you, talk with you, love you, help you feel seen, help you feel lifted up. So Lord, thank you for our time. We pray your blessing over a time of response right now. All the conversations that are in the room, Lord, would your nearness be on display with each of us? Holy Spirit, we need your help, and we are excited to partner with you right now in whatever it is that you want to do.